For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation.
The New York Jets select Blair Thomas, running back, Penn State.
Yeah, this really didn't work out for the Jets, did it? The New York Jets have had many, and I truly mean many first-round busts in franchise history. From the likes of wide receiver Lam Jones in 1980, to defensive end Vernon Gholston in 2008, to quarterback Zach Wilson in 2021, to, of course, fullback Roger Vick in 1987, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, perhaps the bust that stings the most for Jets fans, and is the bust that is most infamously remembered, or at least was before they whiffed on multiple quarterbacks in the last decade, was this man right here, Penn State running back Blair Thomas. After picking up roughly 3,200 yards of offense at Penn State over his final 2 healthy seasons there, everyone thought that Thomas was the best, most surefire pick in the 1990 NFL Draft, and he was going to completely revitalize and rejuvenate an offense that was third from the bottom in points in 1989, and was near the bottom of the league in every major rushing category. Everyone thought that after so many great years with Freeman McNeil running with the football, that Blair Thomas was going to be the successor, and the Jets would have their running back of the 1990s. It did not work out that way at all. Blair Thomas is widely remembered as a top 3 bust in franchise history, and it's not hard to see why, as by the time his time with the Jets ended after just 4 seasons, he had 5 rushing touchdowns, the number 2 overall pick in the draft, and he had 5 rushing touchdowns. New Orleans Saints running back Alvin Kamara, on Christmas Day against the Minnesota Vikings in 2020, had more rushing touchdowns on that day alone than a running back who was the number 2 overall pick in the draft had in his entire time with the team that drafted him, which is obviously really, really bad. And if there's any play that sums up Thomas and his disappointing tenure with the Jets, it's the play that we're going to talk about today. Because when you think of a running back accomplishing some sort of milestone and achieving something monumental, only to have it taken away from him, what's the first thing that comes to mind? It's probably this play right here, involving Atlanta Falcons running back Dave Hampton during the 1972 season. In 1972, the Falcons had never had a 1,000-yard rusher in their franchise's short history. Then came Dave Hampton, and in the final game of the season, a 17-14 loss to the Kansas City Chiefs, he crossed the mark. He got over 1,000 yards. The game was stopped so a ceremony could be held celebrating this momentous occasion, and then he lost 6 yards on his next carry and finished with 995 yards, meaning that he did not, in fact, cross the 1,000-yard mark and did not have that milestone under his belt. Speaking of milestones, we're trying to hit 60,000 subscribers on this channel, so hit that like button down below and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a moment of the action. Your support would be greatly appreciated. We're trying to build this incredible community here, so hit that like button down below and subscribe. Thanks in advance. What you might not realize is that nearly 2 decades later, when it came to the New York Jets, that's sort of what happened to them and running back Blair Thomas. Because this is the story behind Blair Thomas, the record that was taken away from him, and the play that truly summed up Thomas's time in New York more than anything else. Before I talk about the actual play in question, we need some context to understand the game at hand, the game's importance, and how everything was going with said game. It's December 30th, 1990. It's week 17 of the NFL season, and as we're in the final week of the year, we've got an interconference battle on our hands between the New York Jets and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This wasn't the first time that the Jets and Bucs met during the final week of the season, but more on that in a little bit. Unfortunately for both of these teams, this game meant absolutely nothing. There are certain games during the final week of the season with tons of intrigue because of their importance and their significance on the playoff picture. And then, there are games like this one where neither team has anything to play for but pride. The Jets entered this game with a 5-10 record, having completely collapsed down the stretch by winning just 1 of their last 6 games. and the Buccaneers enter this game with a 6-9 record, having lost 7 of their last 9 following a somewhat surprising 4-2 start, and boasting the second worst point differential in the NFC at -101, only ahead of the Phoenix Cardinals. There really wasn't anything to play for from a team perspective, and in fact, depending on your philosophy, maybe if you were a Jets or a Bucs fan, you were actually rooting for your team to lose, so they could get a better draft pick at the 1991 NFL Draft. As for how the game went, again, it didn't mean anything, but for what it's worth, the New York Jets, at the very least, ended their season on a high note, ending it by winning their final 2 games and taking it by a final score of 16-14. They had gone on the road to Tampa Stadium and won it, thanks to a great defensive performance, where the Bucs held onto the ball for just 24 minutes, and where the Bucs turned it over 3 times, including 2 interceptions thrown by future Jet Vinny Testaverde. The Jets had double the rushing yards that Tampa had, winning that battle 155-70, and even that is a bit misleading, because Testaverde had 51 of those yards, so in terms of design runs, the Buccaneers had 12 runs for 19 yards, or roughly 1.5 yards per carry. The Jets had nearly 100 yards more than the Bucs did in total, winning that battle 317-238, and the Jets had, amazingly enough, 4 players run for 35 or more yards, and 4 other players have at least 30 receiving yards. Talk about spreading the wealth around when 8 players have over 30 yards from scrimmage on the day. Even though 1990 was somewhat of a disappointing season for the Jets, especially because they were actually in the thick of things for a playoff spot at the midway point of the season, at least they could end it holding their heads high with a victory. But the real story of the game going into it, if you were a Jets fan, wasn't necessarily whether your team won or lost this completely meaningless game on paper. The story revolved around this man right here, their first-round pick, Blair Thomas. Through the first 13 weeks of the season, Thomas hadn't really gotten a whole lot going. Part of it was that he couldn't hold on to the ball, having 3 fumbles on just 96 carries. Part of it was just head coach Bruce Coslett wanting to go with a completely different offense and going with a running back by committee type of offense. Whatever the case, something wasn't working, and even though Thomas showed flashes, he was in no way whatsoever, whether it was the fault of the coaching staff, or his fault, or a combination of both, doing what most people expected he'd do at this point. Even General Manager Dick Steinberg was stunned by Thomas's lack of productivity in 1990 by the Week 14 bye, saying on him, "It's evolved into a rotating back situation. I didn't conceive that it was going to be like that. I would have expected him to get more carries." Through the first 13 games, this man right here, Blair Thomas, had just 426 yards rushing. However, over the last 2 games before this one, we finally saw it. We saw what Blair Thomas could be and what the Jets expected to get. In Week 15, a 29-21 loss to the Indianapolis Colts, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, Thomas ran 9 times for 63 yards, averaging 7 yards per carry, and he followed that up in Week 16, a 42-7 win over the absolutely hapless division rival New England Patriots, with his best game thus far as a pro, recording 88 rushing yards on 12 carries, averaging over 7.3 yards per carry, and even finding the end zone for the first time on a 6-yard receiving touchdown in the 3rd quarter. Over those 2 games, Thomas had 151 rushing yards and had increased his season total from just 426 yards to 577 yards. Now on the surface, that number might seem incredibly insignificant. That's still a really low total for the 2nd overall pick in the NFL Draft, especially when many people expected that he'd get into the NFL and hit the ground running right away with 1,000 yards. However, I bring up 577 yards because Thomas was chasing something. He was chasing his teammate. He was chasing the man he split carries with. He was chasing this man right here, Freeman McNeil. Back in 1981, the Jets spent their first-round pick, which was number 3 overall, on the UCLA running back. As a side note, to learn more about that 1981 NFL draft, click the card in the upper right corner. McNeil helped guide the Jets to a playoff appearance thanks to 623 rushing yards and being a part of an offense that ranked 6th in the league in rushing yards, having 6 different players run for at least 240 yards. Those 623 rushing yards by McNeil were not just super beneficial to the Jets, but since the NFL expanded to 16 games in 1978, that was the franchise record, with no other running back since going to 16 games even surpassing 400 yards. Thomas had this goal in mind: beat McNeil, beat your mentor, beat the man you're sharing stats with, beat the 16-game franchise record, etch your name in franchise history. And to do this, during that final game of the 1990 season, Thomas knew what he had to do. He needed just 46 yards rushing. Obviously, he wasn't going to get a whole lot of carries. Bruce Coslet did running back by committee, and he was averaging about 7 or 8 carries over his last 9 games. But if he made the most of it, he'd be able to surpass McNeil, and would be able to help his team win the game. But if you get 46 yards, which you surpassed in each of your last 2 games with relative ease, you'd be able to beat this man right here, and you'd be able to top Freeman McNeil. And sure enough, Blair Thomas did just that. Because on his first 5 carries of the game, Thomas had 47 rushing yards. He had a 35-yard run at one point, and in the second quarter, with the Jets trailing 7-6, got the ball and punched it in from 5 yards out to not only give the Jets a 13-7 lead, but to give him his first ever rushing touchdown in the NFL, 1 week after his first touchdown. You could feel the tide turning in Thomas's favor. Over his last 5 halves of football, the man had found the end zone in some capacity twice, and had 200 rushing yards. He was playing, at least in part, like that number 2 draft pick that everyone expected. And thanks to that half and that late surge at the end of the season, he had officially etched his name in history and had beaten his mentor. Freeman McNeil's total of 623 yards, which was the Jets' franchise record in a 16-game season, was topped. Blair Thomas had surpassed him. Blair Thomas was alone atop the mountain. He had 624 yards, 1 more than McNeil, which feels oddly fitting, seeing as Thomas was taken 1 pick higher than McNeil was, being taken 2nd, while McNeil was taken 3rd. Again, was this the season that Blair Thomas and the New York Jets envisioned? Absolutely not. I think if you told most people at the start of the season when the Jets drafted Thomas that the 16-game franchise record was McNeil at 623, they would have expected Thomas to surpass that with ease by Thanksgiving. But this was a nice consolation prize nonetheless, and seemed like it absolutely could be a sign of things to come. Thomas was in the record books, and they couldn't take that away from him. And then came his first carry of the second half.
Tony Easley is the guy who can play a lot of places in this league.
Blair Thomas can't get away. Great penetration. The first one, Scow, really stuffed the play.
Yep, you saw that right. Your eyes did not deceive you. Blair Thomas got dropped in the backfield for a loss of 4 yards. He went from 624 yards, which was ahead of Freeman McNeil, and was the 16-game franchise record that no one had come close to topping and had been intact for a decade, to 620 yards, behind McNeil and out of first place. But okay, this isn't a big deal, right? It's 1 carry. He can easily get those 4 yards back again to break the record and hold it for good. Especially because that was in the 3rd quarter, and he was averaging over 7 yards per carry in this one, even despite the loss of 4. And that'd be true if he ever touched the ball again. Because despite all of that, and despite everything I mentioned, Blair Thomas never touched the ball after that play. That 4-yard loss, that was his final touch of the 1990 season. That was his final carry of the year. And that meant that Thomas finished the season with 620 yards, 3 yards behind Freeman McNeil. This was the Jets' version of the Dave Hampton incident with the Falcons 2 decades before. He had the record. 1 carry lost it, and he never got it back. And what's crazy about the game between these two teams behind me right here isn't just the fact that this wasn't the first time that the Jets and Bucs met in the final week of the season, but it wasn't even the first time there was a rushing controversy in said game. In 1984, the New York Jets played the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Buccaneers had nothing really to play for, but there was something of note for the Bucs because James Wilder was second all-time in NFL history in yards from scrimmage with just over 2,200. The record was Eric Dickerson that same season at 2,244, and the Buccaneers really wanted to make sure that Wilder got that record. So, what the Buccaneers did leading 41-14 was they intentionally allowed the Jets to score a touchdown in the fourth quarter so they could get Wilder the ball back and keep feeding him and try and get him the record. It's a bizarre story that I'll have to cover at some point, even though there's not a lot of footage available. But just know that when the Jets and the Bucs play each other in the final week of the season, a lot of shenanigans tend to happen when it comes to the rushing side of things. Because of the 4-yard loss, this man's 16-game season record, the record of Freeman McNeil in 1981, was still intact. And amazingly enough, it stayed intact all the way until 2006, when Leon Washington had 650 rushing yards as a rookie. This record that you're watching right now was in place for a quarter century, as for whatever reason, no rookie running back could really have a ton of success right off the bat in the Big Apple, at least when it came to the Jets. But it didn't have to be that way. McNeil easily could have gone down. McNeil easily could have been dethroned. If Blair Thomas never touched the ball again, or did quite literally nothing, it would have been. Obviously, head coach Bruce Coslett wasn't thinking about this record right here by McNeil. He had a game to win. But if he was thinking about it, the Jets' record books would have looked a heck of a lot different. Because when it came to Blair Thomas and his quest to break this record by Freeman McNeil, it ended in nothing but disblair. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.